Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about the film Moonraker from 1979. And this is continuing my series that's leading up to the release of Spectre, where I review all of the fourth James Bond films of the various Bonds. Before I did Connery's, which was Thunderball, this is Roger Moore's fourth Bond entry, and the 11th James Bond movie overall. Moonraker is kind of the film that anyone who was a kid when this came out or grew up with this movie has a real personal attachment to, despite not being a great Bond movie or a great movie in general. And I understand that maybe I missed the boat on Moonraker, maybe I'm not the right age for Moonraker, or maybe this movie isn't very good. This one comes after The Spy Who Loved Me, which was considered Roger Moore's best Bond film at the time and continued to be his best Bond film with the release of the subsequent other ones, although For Your Eyes Only's I like that one. And View to the Kill has its kitschy charm. But the point is it was very celebrated. A lot of people really liked The Spy Who Loved Me. Even people who didn't really like Roger Moore in his previous two Bond films to The Spy Who Loved Me. And then he came out with Moonraker. And The Spy Who Loved Me was more of trying to get back to quote-unquote classic Bond or really better storytelling. And they acted like For Your Eyes Only would be the next one. You know, at the end of the Bond film, sometimes it says James Bond will be back. That's what they do nowadays. But it used to say James Bond will be back in and would give you a title. And at the end of The Spy Who Loved Me, it said James Bond will be back in For Your Eyes Only. The Spy Who Loved Me came out in 1977, and for those of you who don't know film history or pop culture history or what Star Wars is, Star Wars came out in 1977 and completely changed everything because they're like, whoa, Star Wars made like a lot of money. Why should we do this great Bond movie when we could put James Bond in space because space is big now? Let's do a sci-fi James Bond movie. And that was seriously why they did it. They completely changed their original plan to make For Your Eyes Only, and they just went full steam ahead with Moonraker. They were like, this is going to be a huge movie because James Bond is in space. Who wouldn't want to see that? Sci-fi's huge right now. The post-Star Wars boom did create kind of some fairly forgettable films. Saturn VII, Black Hole. Black Hole's a little more memorable, but it's not a great movie. Flash Gordon. Alien actually got made because of Star Wars' success. And Moonraker was trying to bank on that, and it banked on it very well. It actually was the highest grossing James Bond film until GoldenEye came along. That is not adjusted for inflation. Adjusted for inflation, Thunderball was. But Moonraker was tremendously successful. So much so it took over like 16 years for another Bond film to outgross it. I wasn't alive then in 1979, and I wasn't a kid when this sort of thing would have gotten me, or a kid who had a dad who even liked Roger Moore, so that's another thing. But this film has always been infamous to me because there was one time I had my friend Mike Anderson over and we got kind of fucked up and watched this movie, and the whole time we had this joke, and they're still not in space. And we just kept repeating it because I was like, hey, I haven't seen this, but when you look online, all the posters are James Bond in space. So this will be really cool. And he was like, oh yeah, let's watch Moonraker. How could this be a tedious bore of a fucking movie? And then we proceeded to watch, of its 126-minute runtime, about the last half hour is in space. And everything leading up to that is this tedious MacGuffin. It's so tedious is not the right word for it. I know a lot of Bond films are like way longer than they ever should be and have way too much crap in them, but this movie pushes that. Bond films are excessive and kitschy, but this movie just like goes full steam ahead in such a regard. The plot is so MacGuffin filled when you eventually find out it was like truly meaningless, and it was just so Bond could go to all these different locations. And still to this day I can text Mike Anderson and say, and we're still not in space, because living through this movie is such a tedious, excessive glut of a James Bond film. After a Moonraker ship that goes into space, a space plane, I guess, is at the beginning of the film on an airplane and being transported, I believe, to the US by the English for some reason, or vice versa or something, is then hijacked and destroys the plane that it is attached to and flies off. And so James Bond has to go and investigate what exactly happened to the Moonraker shuttle and gets the help of CIA agent Holly Goodhead. Yes, that was her name. time in this movie to try to figure out what Hugo Drax, the man who made the Moonraker ship, might possibly know about it, just because he's like, let's just check this out and figure out what he's exactly up to, while Richard Kiel's Jaws is also chasing him for reasons that really become unclear for most of the movie until later, and then they clear it up. And he has to hopefully find out what he's doing with the Moonraker ship and hopefully stop his evil plan. As I talked about and before, the plot of this movie is really long and makes no sense. And then eventually when he talks to Hugo Drax and has the part where he's like, explain your evil plan, because it's a James Bond movie, he just goes like, oh yeah, one of my ships broke and I needed another one, so we stole it. And I was like, wait, what? I sat through 90 minutes for that? That was it? And then movie moves on and becomes a much more interesting space movie. But that is not an exaggeration. That is the plot of 2/3 of Moonraker. And the plot of this movie feels like a dream you had of what a James Bond movie was. There's a part where he's about to go over a waterfall, and then Roger Moore hang glides. He hang glides into the Amazon or something, and then he comes out and he finds these perfect genetic specimen ladies, and then a boa constrictor attacks him. He kills the boa constrictor, and then Jaws brings him out of the water where the boa constrictor was. That part was cool to watch, but I was like, what is going on in this movie? And the thing that separates a good James Bond movie from a bad one is that I can kind of understand the plot and kind of get into it and understand what's going on, at least while you're watching the movie. Some of them, like later when you're trying to describe them, you're like, there are these missiles, or like a hard drive with people's names, or something was gonna explode, or there's a laser. You don't know, but while you're watching it, it makes sense. Moonraker just does not care about that. Moonraker's like, you're not gonna remember this crap anyway, so who cares? This does follow the pattern that I'm starting to notice with fourth James Bond films. The guy who's playing Bond really kind of doesn't care as much. They're like really kind of just showing up. They're doing what they're supposed to do, or are forced to contractually to do. And this isn't a particularly great Roger Moore performance. Lewis Gilbert, who directed You Only Live Twice and A Spy Who Loved Me, which I like The Spy Who Loved Me a lot, and it's really disappointing that the follow-up and this franchise's follow-up was not at all like that. And each Bond movie is a reaction to the previous Bond film, so if the previous Bond film was a dud, they try to make a really good one. And this is an exception in that it's not a reaction to The Spy Who Loved Me. It takes advantage of the good graces of The Spy Who Loved Me, certainly, but it's really a reaction to Star Wars. It's not a reaction to The Spy Who Loved Me at all. I kind of wish I could have gotten that follow-up. Stuff like this is why people, like my dad, never liked Roger Moore. I'm not as cold on Roger Moore, but Moonraker just feels like the almost greatest example of what was wrong with him, especially all his jokes about women, like that he can't comprehend that a woman would be a scientist. I mean, some of this is just James Bond in general, but the way Roger Moore delivers it, it feels like he like overdoes it with like, a lady doing things, this is crazy. It just feels like a lot of times they just put things in so they can have the sexist assholes in the audience laugh about it. And there's often parts where the movie just stops. He'll say a joke and the movie will stop, like Kramer just walked into the apartment and everybody stops so the audience can laugh. And it was like really tone deaf, because sometimes he'd make jokes that it was like, was that a joke? You're like that guy in the office who says something that you think is a joke but is not a joke. One point she was like, oh, even a 70-year-old can survive like Mach 7. And he goes, well, the thing is, you can never find a good 7-year-old when you need them. What is that's your joke? Right? That was a joke. There's a lot of bad humor in this. Roger Moore was not good with the jokes. James Bond doing jokes, they really overdo it. Like, see, James Bond doesn't take things seriously. Ha ha ha. I really don't like Roger Moore in this. I felt like probably his best attempt at Bond was in the last one. In this one, he's like, hey, we're in good graces, and this is a movie that has space stuff in it, so I'm good. I don't even need to give a shit. That's the thing about the fourth one. They're not hungry anymore. They don't care as much. They know you were gonna show up. They're not worried anymore that like maybe this thing will fall apart. This is really like the victory lap. He just feels like more on autopilot, more just like, oh, I know how to do this, and that's boring to watch. Lewis Gilbert, I wish he had gotten to do more, but this also feels like him just doing what he has to do, what probably Broccoli wanted him to do. I really dislike a lot of this film. I like the space part, and I think the thing with the part in the space station, the movie has a plot. Like, he wants to make this master race, he's going to destroy the Earth. You understand like what the stakes are, what he's fighting against, what the evil plan is. And before, it was like, what's going on? Like, what's the point of all this? The part in the space station, not because I liked watching things go boom and laser guns and things like that, but also because it really, really works a lot better, and the story is structured a lot better, and you understand the point of it. There's two performances in this film. Louise Chills, I think, who plays Holly Goodhead, who's tremendously bad. She just looks so vacant. She's pretty, and I guess as terrible and sexist as that is to say, she does fulfill that part of the Bond girl thing, but she's just so vacant. And sure, not every Bond girl is the greatest actress in the world, but she is like really bad. She like sucks all the life out of the room. And then you have Roger Moore trying to have chemistry with her, and he doesn't really give a shit. And I don't even know if she can give a shit. Like, I think she's just vacant all the time. A lot of people suggest that she was high throughout this whole movie. That's maybe giving her too much credit. Then you have Michael Lonsdale, who plays Drax, who is also kind of vacant. He does it in a very villainy, kind of crazy, creepy way that I actually think kind of works for it. He's using it as an actor's tool, as an instrument. I don't think he's the greatest Bond villain. I thought it was at least an attempt at being a good Bond villain, but Bond villains are best when they're over the top and verbose, like Spectre-y kind of, and he's just like not bringing that. But it was an interesting idea to kind of play it with less passion, like he is so removed from the human race. Of course, he'd want to destroy it. This also has Jaws, who is not the shark, but the guy with the metal teeth, who for most of the movie is chasing James Bond, and everything I read was like, because he said he'd defeat James Bond no matter what. And although the only direct sequel in the James Bond franchise is really when you get to Daniel Craig and you have Quantum of Solace, this is semi that, because you have Richard Keel's Jaws come back for this, but you don't really understand, like, is he working for Drax, or is he just like another part of it? And for a lot of the movie, why is Jaws in this? Like, I get that people like Jaws, he was cool in The Spy Who Loved Me, but why is he here? And you just don't know at all. Roger Moore probably has more of the Bond films that are kind of kitschy and stupid but still fun to watch, and for a lot of people that is Moonraker, I guess, and I guess I kind of get it because of the space stuff. But sitting through this with my friend Mike Anderson, I always remember where we're like, and they're still not in space. I mean, the fact that most of this movie means seriously nothing, it became such a joke between me and Mike, and we texted each other still. He made this, which I don't know if you can see it that well, but it says Moonraker up here, and then under here it says, and they're still not in space. I'll have a picture. I've always really cherished this. He told me I should get a stand that like lights up from the bottom, and I still haven't, so I'm sorry about that, Mike. When I think of Moonraker, I think of That Good Time. And when I was watching during this, I was like, is it the worst James Bond? No. I kind of get good times and nostalgia attached to a movie, and I understand that. And although I am going to text Mike right after I film this and say, and they're still not in space, and I love that joke, and I love that I have a joke with someone based on that movie, I'm not going to act like this is a good movie, and I'm not going to act like this is a good James Bond film. And it's really a deviation during part of Roger Moore's run that actually started to work. You finally get somewhere, and then next you just like drop the ball tremendously. And it does follow suit where when Roger Moore took over, the Bond films started to just do the thing that they've continued to do, where they're not really trendsetters anymore. They're taking things that are popular and integrating that into James Bond, whether it be blaxploitation or kung fu or Christopher Lee or things in space. And we have it even with Casino Royale and parkour, or Skyfall being a very Christopher Nolan-y influenced Bond film. And it really kind of started around the time of Roger Moore. They did it a little with Connery, but I really think it took flight with the Roger Moore stuff. Moonraker is a shining example of how they're just like, hey, this is big, let's do it. I think if this film hadn't been so aimless for majority of it, maybe I could get into the kitsch of the whole thing. I like the Shirley Bassey theme song. I like that it has a regular version and a disco version. I like certain things about Moonraker, and I think I was maybe a little too tough on it the first time I saw it and thought, and they're still not in space. But in a real consumer way of viewing this movie was sold on James Bond being in space, and he's not in space in most of it. And I think that's the biggest problem with Moonraker, is the fantasy of Moonraker doesn't live up to the movie. And James Bond films are already fantasies. And I get that the fantasy of James Bond films will not live up to life. But I shouldn't see the advertising of a James Bond movie and that should fail to live up to a James Bond movie. I already have reality to do that. I don't need the movies to do that. So if you have seen Moonraker and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to. And check out my James Bond review playlist. It has all the third James Bond movies of these various Bonds in there as well, and you can check out the last James Bond review, which was of Thunderball. Hopefully the next review will be Die Another Day. I'm not sure if I will get that out before Spectre, but the next review will potentially probably be a James Bond review. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you next time.